Good evening, everyone. I'm Janet Dolan, and on behalf of the Minnesota Peace Initiative, I'd like to welcome you to our winter program. We appreciate your willingness to take part in another virtual program. We all want to get back to live get-togethers as soon as we can. So we hope this is our last virtual program. When I accepted the Go Viking Award in 2006, I said that democracy is not a spectator sport. We all have to get off the sidelines and be involved and engaged. Therefore, my husband and I set up the Minnesota Peace Initiative as part of the Norway House. The Minnesota Peace Initiative provides a forum in which to discuss important issues of the day. It is based on the belief that a well-informed electorate is critical to the success of a healthy democracy. This has never been more true than today. When I was in college in the late 60s, I was active in many change efforts, such as civil rights and the women's movement. At that time, I often wondered how the world would change during my lifetime. In all my speculating about potential future changes, I never once questioned the ongoing success of our democratic form of government. I never imagined that we might have dueling narratives about the legitimacy of an election. I never imagined that we might have an attack on our capital in order to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. I never imagined that states would use their legislative powers to possibly, under certain circumstances, undermine the will of its own people at the ballot box. And yet, that is where we are today. It is because of that realization that tonight we have brought together three individuals who have devoted their careers to building democracies, writing about democracies, and working in public diplomacy. We have invited them here tonight for a discussion, not about is it inevitable that we will lose our democracy, but rather, where are we in the evolution of our democracy? And most importantly, what do we need to do to keep it alive, thriving, and available for our children and our grandchildren? So let me introduce our guests. It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Hanson. Tom is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, whose diplomatic postings included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. Tom currently serves as diplomat in residence at the Allworth Institute for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. He's also active in many international organizations and speaks extensively throughout the world on topics of diplomacy and international relations. Our second guest is Anne Applebaum, a noted writer, speaker, and expert in the field of democracy. Specifically, how do you build it? How do you keep it? And how do you lose it? Her book, Twilight of Democracy, is a bestseller. She continues to write thought-provoking articles for the Atlantic magazine, including her recent article, The Bad Guys Are Winning. Our third guest this evening is Judge Jack Tunheim, Chief Judge of the U.S. Federal District Court in Minnesota. He's also a jurist who has dedicated his career to helping countries, especially post-Cold War emerging democracies, to build and sustain viable democracies, courts, and other institutions necessary to establish and maintain the rule of law. We look forward to a very engaging discussion. Tom Hanson will lead a fireside chat with our two guest speakers. We will then open the floor to questions from you. This is a webinar format. The panelists and I cannot communicate directly with you. Therefore, to ask a question, click or tap Q&A, and the location of this function will depend on the device you're using. But when you do click on it, a window will appear, and just type in your question, press enter to send. We will collect your questions and get to as many as time allows. It takes some effort behind the scenes to get these questions well organized, so please submit your questions as soon as you can. And finally, to leave the webinar, select End and then Leave Meeting. We will begin with a pre-taped opening conversation with Tom and Ms. Applebaum. After the opening, we will go live to our fireside chat, and then we will go to your questions. Thank you for joining us this evening. We've had an outstanding attendance for tonight's program. The first 50 people to register were lucky enough to get a free copy of Twilight of Democracy. If you are not one of the lucky 50, but would like a copy, they are widely available online. We will now begin with Tom's taped conversation with Ms. Applebaum, and then Tom will open the live fireside chat with Ms. Applebaum and Judge Tunheim. We hope you enjoy the evening.
Welcome, Ann Applebaum, and thank you so very much for joining us for this program on democracy organized by the Minnesota Peace Initiative. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Great. And I'm looking forward to our brief conversation right now to sort of set the stage for tonight's discussion. And so let's get underway with my first question. After a time of optimism in the 1990s at the end of the Cold War, democracy is backsliding in any number of countries today. In your excellent book, Twilight of Democracy, which I highly recommend, you wrote that given the right conditions, any society can turn away from democracy. So in your view, what are the key conditions right now that are working against democracy in the present day?
So I should say that the idea that any society can turn away from democracy is not original to me. Our founding fathers, when they wrote the US Constitution, also knew that democracy could fail, and they talked about it while they were writing the rules of democracy for the country, and they were thinking about how to prevent demagogues from rising, how to prevent bad decisions from being made, how to prevent institutions from declining. And some of the choices they made explain some of the quirks of our Constitution. And it's a longer argument. I would say that some of them don't work anymore. But the notion that democracy can fail has always been with us. But in the last several decades, I think because of America's success, because of our prosperity, because of our global reach, we gained the impression that democracy can never fail. We are living now in a time of genuinely unprecedented change, economic change, demographic change, social change, change in behavior of all kinds, also informational change. The way in which we all get and process information about the world is radically different now from what it was like even 10 years ago. And at times of change, many people become bothered by the pace of change, and many people are also bothered by the experience of cacophony, the idea that there's a lot of noise, that there are clashing views, that there's no agreement, there's no social compact that they can be part of. And there's a part of every society that really misses that. And that's the part of society that sometimes in moments when there is a lot of turmoil, which we have at the moment, begin to long for something different. If we only had just one leader, if we only had something more stable, if only everybody would just shut up and we could just unify around a single idea. And that impulse, which is very human, you can find in pretty much any society. And maybe we shouldn't have been surprised also to find it in the United States. But I really do think that we underestimate the degree to which life is different, much different now than what it was a few years ago, and the way in which a lot of people feel that as either very stressful or as a kind of loss. You know, traditional ways of life, or even just ordinary ways of life that seemed normal 20 years ago or 30 years ago, really are gone and really have been lost. And it's important that everybody else acknowledge that.
You know, in that regard, you cite a distinction in your book between reflective nostalgia and restorative nostalgia. And you also talk about a deep division within the conservative movement compared to, say, in the 1990s. So how does that fit in?
So I made this distinction between different kinds of nostalgia as a way of illustrating one of the sources of extremism on the right. Reflective nostalgia, so the feeling of liking old churches or liking old things or liking old furniture or old houses, which I do, is something that's very different from restorative nostalgia. So the belief that things were better in the past, that 30 years ago, America was a better country. And the belief that it was so much better that what we have now isn't even really America anymore, that we've lost so much and the country has been so destroyed and undermined that the only thing left is to destroy it. And restorative nostalgia is actually an extremist feeling or movement, because what it implies is that the system is so corrupt or so undermined or so degenerate or so different from what it was meant to be that there's nothing left to do except to wreck it. And this, of course, this feeling that society must be destroyed in order to be remade anew is the emotion that's empowered extremism of various different kinds over the centuries. The Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917 also thought their society had to be totally destroyed in order to achieve, in their case, an impossible vision of the future. In America, we now have a part of what used to be the conservative movement has been radicalized and is now much more extreme, and now has come to believe that America as it is now must be wrecked or destroyed in order to get back to the past. You know, I sometimes describe this as a form of almost radical disappointment. Sometimes people are disappointed with their lives, their own careers. Sometimes people are disappointed with the society they live in. But whatever it is, this disappointment leads to a kind of extreme despair, and therefore this destructiveness that we now see all around us.
You know, you focus on the role of elites in what's happening with democracy today. And in fact, you quote Julian Brenda, who once referred to the age of the intellectual organization of political hatreds. And just how do you see the role of sort of what you would call the elite, the intelligentsia in America today?
So my book was very specifically about the right-wing elites, and I used that expression because they like to call other people elite. But in fact, you know, we have in this country, just like most countries have, we have conservative intellectuals, many of whom went to our best universities. People who are good at language, they're good at writing, they're well off and wealthy, and who nevertheless have come to buy into this form of kind of existential despair or extremism. And as I said, some of them are motivated, it's for personal reasons. Some of them are motivated by political reasons. Some of them have been so convinced that their political enemies are incorrigible and can't be compromised with, that the only thing left is to fight even with violence against them. And my book actually tried to show the trajectory of the lives of a few people. I chose one or two in Poland, which is where I lived part of the time, one or two in the US, one or two in the UK. And you know, I also wanted to show that this trajectory from conservatism towards really radical extremism you know, is something that happens not just in the US, but in other countries as well.
And what is the role of economic uncertainty I mean, there's a lot of talk about the shrinking middle class. Peggy Noonan once referred to the revolt of the unprotected as a part of what's going on. How big a factor, I mean, every society has economic problems and issues, but how big a factor is that today?
It's very difficult to measure the economic impact on politics, particularly in this regard, because a lot of the people who've become most extreme, certainly on the right in our society, but this actually applies to the left as well, and the people who are most despairing of America and the people who were most willing to support the more extreme forms of Trumpism were not the poorest Americans. So they were not the people who were suffering the most from job losses or from inequality or precarity. And so therefore you have to ask whether the source of that particular form of anti-democratic activism and thinking really had much of an economic tie. It seems to be much more attached to people who feel somehow culturally displaced. They don't feel that their views or their lifestyles or their beliefs are reflected enough in mainstream culture and politics. And many of those people were in fact middle class or even wealthy. If you look at the people, for example, who were at the Capitol at January the 6th, most of those people were not impoverished. Many of them were well off. Many of them were middle class. And so although I think there's a lot wrong with the economics of America and the deep gaps between our billionaire class and the working class are a political problem. I think it's one of the sources of doubt in the system. I mean, many people don't feel the need to participate, or they don't see the point of participating in civic life because it seems so unfair and kind of rigged from the beginning. But I'm not sure that that was the source of the rise of the far right in the US. I think it's got cultural sources rather than economic ones, although, as I say, both are important.
There's also the role of technology. As you pointed out, things are changing very fast. There are new delivery modes of information. But even beyond that, things like facial recognition, AI, I think the Chinese are convinced that the new technologies point in the direction of their kind of system and not toward democracy. So what's the role of technology, and what can we do about the negative impacts?
So this is not the first time that technology has disrupted democracy or society. Actually, the invention of the radio in the early 20th century looked like it would have a similar impact. The first two political leaders who really understood how to use radio were Hitler and Stalin. They were both obsessed with it. They both used it. They both saw it as a way to reach people directly, escaping the traditional gatekeepers, much as people talk about the internet today. And what eventually happened were there's sort of a couple versions of this. One was, a form of broadcasting regulation in the United States. Another was the creation of public radio like the BBC in Great Britain and elsewhere. Getting hold of technology, making sure that it works for democracy, making sure that there's a set of regulations that it fits within in order to enhance democracy and not undermine it, is really a task for our political leadership now. I think there are a few people in Congress who are interested in this, who have begun to talk about it, but we're still pretty far away from any kind of consensus about what should be done. And by regulation, I don't mean censorship. I don't mean that there should be like a big, huge government ministry that decides what can be on Twitter and what can't be. I mean, opening the black box of the algorithms, which for example, on social media, which determine which kinds of posts and which kinds of information spreads fastest. And right now, the algorithms are set to make things that make people angry, that are emotional, that are divisive. That's what spreads fastest, whether it's right wing or left wing. It's not political. Changing that so that what spreads fastest is, broadly defined civilized conversation would, I think, that would already make a big difference, to what our conversation is like. And once again, the use of AI, the use of all these new technologies, each one of them should be looked at from this perspective of democracy. How do we make these work for us? How do we avoid becoming what China is already becoming, which is a kind of technologically inspired surveillance state? So we already know what the autocratic internet looks like. I mean, it looks like China. The state controls what's conversation, it monitors everything that goes on, it keeps tabs on all the citizens. We don't want that, so planning for how to avoid it is something that we should start now.
And thank you. One final question in setting the stage here for a larger discussion. You know, the erosion of norms, it just seems that the folkways of democracy are in some ways as important as the institutions. And how do you see that? I mean, whether it's in terms of education or in terms of how certain parts of our system, like the electoral college, are being misused. Yeah, kind of the erosion of norms.
So it's funny. I teach a class on democracy and on some of these issues at Johns Hopkins University, and literally yesterday, I was asked this question about. We were talking about the 18th century, and we talked about this question of virtue. You know, the founding fathers talked a lot about virtue, and by which they didn't mean Christian virtue. In fact, what they meant was civic virtue, what we sometimes call it civic mindedness. You know, the willingness to play by the rules. And it's true that democracy has always required a kind of unspoken agreement to abide by the rules. You know, that when your political enemies win the election, you agree to let them rule for 4 years, and you wait for your chance to take back power 4 years later, confident that there will be a free election in 4 years. And by the same token, if you win, you preserve the system in such a way that your political enemies will be able to contest you fairly 4 years from now. I mean, that's there are many more aspects to it, but that's the basic promise of democracy. That's the thing that everybody has to buy into for the system to work. And yes, it has broken down, it has eroded in the United States. And I fear that the only way to fix it is going to be through some legal changes. There's a piece of legislation kicking around in Congress now called the Electoral Count Act. We may have to look again at how votes in the Electoral College are tabulated, and how by what means we determine who the president is, to make sure that the rules are clear, because they haven't been as clear as they should be. I mean, we just counted on people's goodwill and good behavior. And so unfortunately, putting some of those norms into law might now be necessary. But I mean, more broadly, obviously civic education, both at the level of schools and at the level of adult education on the internet, trying to find ways to reach people to talk about how the system does work and how it should work, or would also be very welcome. It's a long conversation. I feel like I've been involved in it for a long time. I mean, I think I wrote an editorial about civic education for the first time in the 1990s. So it's an issue that doesn't ever go away.
And thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for your insights on this important issue of democracy. And I think we're ready now to turn things back over to the main program. So thanks again.
Great. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anne, thank you again for the great insights that you offered in our pre-taped interview. And we've come now to the, so we say, fireside chat part of our program. And I'd like to welcome Anne Applebaum back again, and Judge Jack Tunheim for our conversation. So I'm going to start off by citing the Freedom House report on democracy this year. They say that for the 15th year in a row, there is a democratic recession going on in the world, not just in our country, although we have been downgraded in terms of our democracy in their estimation. So you have established democracies like ours backsliding, but also many of the new democracies, including in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So I'd like to ask both of you, and I'll start with Jack here. What are some of the reasons for the backsliding in these new democracies, for example, in Eastern Europe? Jack, you've done a lot of work all around the world trying to help establish legal systems, democratic practices. So how do you see it for countries like Bulgaria that are in the EU, they're in NATO, and yet they're backsliding seriously? How do you see this?
Well, thank you, Tom, and good evening, everyone. I think some of this recession identified by Freedom House is understandable. It's a reaction to democracy failing people, or people believing that democracy is failing. Economic crises, cultural crises are affecting that. Some is a natural tendency of many leaders to want more power, more control, and that is obvious. We've seen that in so many different ways. And there's some concern, obviously, over local issues and turmoil that plague every country. But I do think that the United States bears some blame here. We are the world's democratic leader, and we bear a share of the blame. We're watched very carefully around the world. I know that from my own experiences. Every major event in the United States is understood well throughout the world. January 6th, CIA torture, George Floyd and its aftermath, Guantanamo, perceived arrogance. These events focus attention on stuff that people don't want, and it's easy for them to blame democracy. I do think we need to be a better example for the world, much more of a shining beacon than a dim light in a basket. So we're not totally to blame. There are a lot of other sources there, and there's no reason why we can't turn the recession around. But we need to be strong and to understand our role as a democracy leader.
Anne, how do you see, you live in Poland and you see what's happening in that part of Europe. How do you see this with the new democracies?
So I agree with Judge Tunheim that the United States plays a role as an example in a kind of intangible way. But more important inside these individual democracies is the role being played by unscrupulous politicians who have decided they prefer autocracy, and understanding why they made that decision and what it is that's impelling them and what they think they can gain from it is really important. You know, in the book that you've referred to very kindly several times tonight, you know, I talk a lot about what might motivate people to want to destroy democracy, and usually it's some combination of the kind of disappointment that we talked about. You know, I thought our country would be different, with personal interests. Sometimes, you know, people who haven't succeeded in normal politics, you know, who aren't elected in normal ways or can't keep power in normal ways, think that if they bend the system and break the rules and cheat, then they'll win. And some people see this as a you know, a way to get power and money and a position in, you know, in their countries. And you know, that's a part of the, you know, human experience that we knew existed. We knew there were such unscrupulous, you know, power-hungry, greedy people. There always have been, and it's really just, you know, the job for everybody else is to make sure they don't win. And we've had a number of groups like that win in a number of places. And when they take charge, they try and change the rules. So they, you know, try and politicize the courts, or they try and destroy the media, or they try to, you know, reverse the results of elections in order to stay in power. And so I don't think there's any kind of deep mystery. I don't think it's anything to do with them being former communist countries. You know, you can see very similar kinds of behavior, you know, in parts of Latin America, in countries that weren't communist, and of course in the United States. So I think what we're talking about is people trying to break the rules of democracy. And then the question is, what can everybody else do to make sure that the rules are maintained?
You know, that brings us to the issue of corruption. As Janet noted, you have a very interesting article in The Atlantic an issue or two back about that, and about how, in fact, the United States, in an unfathomable way, actually allows dirty money and all kinds of things to go on. So I'd like to ask both of you, how do you see, and this is not political, this is economic corruption as an issue threatening democracy? I'll start with Anne and then Jack.
So I think economic corruption is hugely important, and that it's very profoundly connected to political corruption. And the degree to which international financial institutions, including American institutions, have facilitated money laundering, which often means nothing more than the theft of money from poor countries and the relocation of that money in America or in Britain or in, or sometimes in Caribbean islands, but it doesn't have to be, has been profoundly damaging around the world, and it's also hurts Americans as well. There are a number of American states that have facilitated money laundering, and they're not, I mean, Delaware is famous for being very easy to register any kind of company there, but South Dakota now has a system where you can create anonymous trusts, and there are a handful of other states as well. In addition to that, we've had very lax laws, particularly surrounding real estate, that have allowed people who have created again, anonymous companies. So we don't know who really they are, who owns who's the real person behind the fake sounding, whatever it is, Paradise Inc., company that owns the apartments. And this has actually been a real source of money in real estate, particularly in New York, Miami, but also LA, and even elsewhere, even in places you wouldn't expect. And certainly all over in many European cities as well. This has distorted property markets. It has corrupted banks and accountants. And it's impossible that money doesn't seep into the political system too, especially given the degree, the ease with which you can purchase influence in U.S. politics. So, the combination of anonymous companies locating their money in America, then using that money for politics is, it's really quite lethal. And I think it's distorted American politics in various ways. I mean, I don't want to politicize this conversation too much, but Donald Trump's career was largely enabled. At certain moments, he was clearly rescued by foreign money, in some cases Russian money, that pulled his apartment buildings and real estate investments out of a hole. And so, the source of his interest in Russia is that. I mean, it's, he wasn't a spy, he wasn't recruited. He was just favorable to Russia because Russian money had rescued his business a number of times. And so that's a small illustration of the way in which those kinds of transactions can, shape politics in unexpected ways.
Jack?
Well, I agree. I mean, economic corruption is a significant problem, not only in the United States, but around the world, but particularly here. I think part of it is that we provide so many avenues for money laundering in this country. And what we don't have really are the institutions that have the resources or perhaps the willpower to really protect against extensive economic corruption. And I think that's part of the problem. There are so many small, low-hanging fruit, so to speak, players who get prosecuted. Well, the larger, more difficult to prove cases just are not brought. So, I mean, I agree that economic corruption is a huge problem. It spills over into the political system, and it is in many respects protected by the political system as well. So it's a problem. How you deal with it, I think, is much more of a tough issue, because we need to have regulatory institutions that have the resources and the ability to go after economic corruption in all of its forms.
We've talked about the erosion of norms. A democracy, if you can keep it, as the founding fathers said. And Jack, I'd like to ask you about the initiatives you're involved with right now on justice and democracy, actually trying to get at some of these problems and make things better. Could you just tell us about that for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's quite clear to me and to many who are observant of the situation that we have lapsed in our focus on civics education in this country. We have focused heavily on STEM education, which there's no problem with that. It's been very beneficial in many ways, but I don't think we have the focus on civics education for our young people that we had in generations past, and it is starting to show. What we're trying to do about it at the court here in Minnesota is to establish what we're calling justice and democracy centers in our St. Paul and Minneapolis courthouses, which will provide essentially a museum quality experience focused mostly on middle school, but high school and younger as well. Focus on learning about the Constitution, about democracy, about voting, about citizenship, about the great cases of history that affect their lives today and why they're so important. We want to help them understand the importance of an independent judiciary and also focus on some of the bad things this country has done in the past. Give students the opportunity to see hearings in court, to talk with a judge, and hopefully inspire future leaders, not only as lawyers, but also as public figures in the years to come. I think that we will be able to have a capacity of up to 10,000 students on field trips each year when we're fully have our centers underway. And I'm looking forward to it because I think we can make a difference. I hope we can provide an example for courts throughout the country to devote some time to focusing on healing this dearth of civics education that Chief Justice Roberts has made very clear to all of us that we should be doing.
Great. That's it's good to hear something actually being done about this key issue. This brings me to the question of trust, which obviously lies at the basis of any democracy. A Pew poll not long ago found, they asked the question, do you believe that people cannot be trusted? And over 65s said 29% agreed people cannot be trusted. But in the 18 to 29-year-old age, 60% said that people cannot be trusted as a rule. And so we seem to have lost trust in each other and also in our institutions. So how do you see that issue of trust, and how in the world can we restore it in our society? That's a big question, but it's a key question, I think. Anne, we'll start with you and then Jack.
I mean, I'm not going to have a pat answer to the question of how we recreate trust, because, it may be a kind of generation-long project. I would like to think that the kinds of work that Judge Tunheim is talking about is the beginning of it. Thinking about what are the civic initiatives that can bring people together from different parts of the political divide. What are the themes that unify us? What are the things that, there are a lot of things we can't talk about anymore. What are the things that we can talk about? Can we focus on some of those? Can we, there are a number of organizations, that I'm aware of that have tried to do this explicitly, bringing together people from different parts of the political divide. It may be that we need something more than that. We may need some joint projects. What is it that people with different political views can do together, whether it's creating a civic education program, or whether it's, making decisions about, in their local towns. I mean, it may also be that we need to think a little bit more about how to make our democracy more relevant and more real to people. I really like to see more American states experimenting with different voting systems, with ranked choice voting systems that give people a wider sense. It's not, that don't divide people so harshly into two political tribes. I'd like to see a lot more localities experimenting with ways to have public conversations. There are now some really interesting internet programs, things you can do online, that can bring together wide ranges of people, allow them to contribute, and then rather than, it's not Twitter or Facebook, it doesn't immediately divide you. There are ways in which you can look for commonalities. I think political leaders need to also think a lot about what are they doing? How are they communicating? How can they bring people in, in a world where people are much more online now than they used to be? How can they bring them into political conversations? Because a lot of the old-fashioned political institutions just don't do that anymore. So it would take creativity from citizens. It'll take creativity from politicians. May take creativity from journalists. And journalists, some journalists do think about this. How to reach different audiences. That's essentially what it's about, and how to go into different communities. But it's a project that I think is something that almost everybody can participate in if they want to.
Jack?
Yeah. I agree. Those strategies, I think, are very, very helpful and useful, in addition to really focusing much more on civics education. In terms of our political leadership, I would really like to see a return, and most everyone would, to our legislative bodies being elected from fairly drawn districts. The fact that so many of our legislators, state and federal, mostly fear an extremist challenge within their own party is an absolute prescription for conflict and disaster. And that's why so many things cannot be done. It's really all about power rather than about how we can seek the greater good for the most people. I think gerrymandering is unconstitutional. I've always believed that, and I believe that when it's done by either side. But I do think that other strategies are helpful too. I do believe that economic inequality and the increasing gap is really impacting our country and our trust in one another and in our institutions. More progressive taxation, more focus on civics education for all ages, listening to valid complaints and acting on them. I mean, I think it's a failure to act on the great crises of our time that will continue to rile up the masses and make them susceptible to the tyrants. And building economic independence from the bottom should be a strategy that would build a stronger economic base and much more trust in our country.
Speaking of trust and the masses, there have been a number of books written. Michael Sandel at Harvard wrote a book called Tyranny of Merit. Several others are talking about how, in a way, the elites in our country, including the Democrats, are distrustful of the common man, of the masses. And of course, that's going back to Plato. That often has been the view. Populism is now a negative term, whereas in the late 19th century, it was a progressive movement. We in the Midwest remember the original populism. And so how do we speak to the masses? Sandel's point is that by favoring university education and speaking of deplorables, the Democrats prepared the way for Trump, actually, who did find a way to address the larger base of the population. So, I mean, it's a little bit of an unfocused question, but I mean, this brings the Democrats in a little bit as part of the problem. So any comments?
So first of all, I mean, that has to be picked apart a little bit. I mean, Trump never had a majority, and actually most of the poorest Americans didn't vote for Trump. So I think that his messaging wasn't really about the masses. It was actually directed, it had other undertones. It was directed again at a particular political tribe and people who feel displaced from politics, sometimes for racial or for, sometimes for class reasons as well. Also, I always wonder when people start talking about elites, who are the elites exactly? Because there's a business elite in America, which is not necessarily democratic, democratic in the sense of Democratic Party. There is an academic elite, there's an intellectual elite. There's also, there are other kinds of local elites, and I'm not sure they all track the same way or have the same influence. And the expression, the elites has been sort of memeified. I mean, it's been made into something. So so we all hate school teachers or something like that. I mean, having said that, there is an additional problem, which is there is a part of the Democratic Party or part of what you could broadly call the left, and it's a part, it's not all of it, that has become sort of wrapped up in many of its own arguments and doesn't think much about how to reach people or how to connect with people, and is more focused on arguments about ideological purity and being correct rather than on what ordinary people want. And by ordinary people, I mean not the masses, but I mean, lots of different kinds of people from different classes. But and it's, the Democrats need to keep focused on how to talk to people, how to reach people, what are the issues that move people. There's no question in my mind that that's true, and it's clearly there's a part of the party that has forgotten that. I mean, in a way, it's what Judge Tunheim was saying. The problem of being concerned only with things that go on inside your own party or your own group is not just a Republican problem, it's also a Democratic problem. I mean, people who are elected from districts where there's no way they're ever going to lose because no Republicans live there, have a different way of thinking about the world from people who live in very competitive districts. And you can even see this in Congress when you hear, who represents which districts and how they talk. And it's really important that all of the Democrats think about reaching all of the country, just, as the way I would like all Republicans to think harder about reaching all of the country and not just their own side. Well, I'll stop there.
Jack?
Yeah, I agree. And I would just add that, I think there is a role for building in a positive way, building a kind of immunity not only in young people, but people generally in the country, a positive way toward an immunity to the kind of populism that extremism is exploiting right now. And that's where I think civics education comes in. And it's not just for young people, but I think that is where the focus should be. So, I mean, I think that there is a lot to be said for forcing politicians to govern from the middle, and whatever kinds of institutions we can build to encourage that, we're going to be better off because we're going to build consensus. And consensus is what people eventually want, even with the extremists that are in favor today.
You know, a common theme in science fiction is that we're heading toward some kind of a technocracy, right? In other words, that the people who control the technology will eventually control the politics as well. And so when you see the very large tech companies now and the role they have, and I might say that, you know, for an average American, in terms of the big forces in their lives, you've got the Fed on the economy, you've got the Supreme Court now, which, you know, a couple of presidents that didn't get the majority of the vote actually appointed 5 of them. And then the tech companies, none of which are elected. So is our political system mutating in front of our very eyes into something other than what's in the Constitution, in which the real political forces and economic forces are outside of the purview of the voter?
So this is not the first time that question has been asked in American history. You know, you referred to the progressive movement before from the 19th century, and that of course was a reaction to the monopolies of that time. You know, in that case, it was railroads and oil and so on, and now it's Twitter and Facebook, or not so much Twitter, Facebook and Google. And the reaction at the time was to begin to regulate them, to find ways of making sure that the big American companies served American general interests, that they didn't only serve the interests of their CEOs and a small handful of shareholders. It's really is my belief. I genuinely believe that it is possible to regulate the tech companies too. And we should have started working on it a long time ago. Actually, I think our deep political divisions is one of the things that's prevented that from happening. But you know, I've myself written about this, but many other people have. I mean, there are ways, and we referred to it in the conversation that you and I did prior to tonight. There are ways to think about regulation. There would be ways to, you know, open up the black box of algorithms and regulate those. This is not about censorship. It's about taking them under control. And there would be ways of making sure that they work on all of our interests. And I really do hope that our politicians find the time, and you know, I know everybody's overwhelmed and there's a lot going on, but that they find the time to really address that issue, to hold hearings on it and look deeply into how to do it, because it's possible and it's necessary, just like it was at the beginning of the 20th century.
I think it is indeed possible. We have found ways to appropriately regulate technology many times over in our nation's history, and we can do it again. Part of the problem is the political power that technology companies have gained over the years, and we all know that political power is exercised with Congress and with regulators. But I think we have a system now where people are heavily reliant on technology, but they're also deeply distrustful of it. So I'm not sure that any kind of technology wave, an unregulated technology wave, is going to work in our country today. We have a system that works well enough for leaders and protects wealth. I don't think there'll be a heavy appetite for change, certainly not a sort of a libertarian model in which technology rules the day. So I think I agree with Ann that effective regulation is the direction to go. It's hard, but it's something that needs to be done.
You know, Jack, you mentioned how some of the problems we've been having in our democracy have an impact on other democracies around the world, and probably are not helping in their attempt to keep their democracies. Turning it around, analysts like Yascha Mounk and others have pointed out how in some ways, authoritarian countries can be seen as outperforming democracies right now by certain standards, right? In terms of long-term planning, certain other indices. So, I mean, would you say that our democracy now is being challenged by a new system, the kind of the technocratic long-term system like China has, using the modern technologies for governance, governance we don't agree with, but which, as I say, does produce some results. How do you see that challenge?
I think it's a big challenge for us. I don't know that it's a challenge that a lot of countries would naturally fall for, other than the economic might of China pushing them in that direction. I do think that that makes a difference. I mean, I think progress in countries that are nominally democracies, but perhaps have a strong leader and there aren't free and fair elections, but there's a certain amount of freedom in the countries. It usually can be measured with 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, maybe 1 step forward, another step back. We're seeing that in a lot of places. But I do think that one of the reasons why these countries are perhaps doing better on a democracy scale is economic health, and the fact that it keeps the so-called masses off the streets. If life is okay, then democracy is wonderful. And even countries that do not regularly experience free and peaceful transfer of power, they do recognize that economic development, work opportunities, protection of contracts, some semblance of human rights will keep their own version of democratic institutions working. It's less messy, but people stay happy in that kind of scheme. And that's why they may be outperforming us in some ways, but perhaps don't have the level of freedoms that we have.
Anne, you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, this is always one of those difficult, questions. I mean, people start saying, "Oh, autocracies are better," and then, okay, which autocracies? Well, okay, China seems to do some things well, but actually Zimbabwe does some things pretty badly. Some people admire elements of what Russia does, but then they note that most Russians live in poverty. I mean, so it's you can cherry pick the results of different countries and different places. You can look at some aspects of what life is like in China and not see the rest. I mean, I think it's pretty telling that Americans aren't screaming and flooding to move to China. And the attraction of China, on the contrary, young Chinese people, and the wealthier they are and the better connected they are, the more this is true, are dying to study and live in the United States. And so, while there are aspects of any political system that we can learn from. I mean, I don't think we have everything right or everything about America is perfect, far from it. And you're right that the ability to long-term plan, to think about things that will happen in 10 or 20 years, we used to have more of that in America. So it certainly was possible under a democracy, but it required some bipartisan cooperation and some sense of a long-term dedication to American democracy, and we don't have that now. So I would also hesitate, saying, are the problems that we have at the moment, are they the faults of democracy, or are they the faults of the particular politics of the moment? I mean, if we were able to do it 20 or 30 years ago when we were also a democracy and we can't do it now, then we need to explain that, within our own context and not sort of look at other people and imagine it's better. I mean, as I say, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. In the 1930s and 1940s, there was a part of the American left that, longed for America to be like the Soviet Union. That all turned out rather badly. I don't want to predict what will happen to China, but as I said, I don't see Americans wanting to impose or create a Chinese system here either anytime soon.
Exactly. And Jack, thank you so much for this conversation, this second part of our program. We want to have a lot of time now for audience questions. So I will thank you both and turn this over now to Janet.
Thank you very much, Tom. We have a quick question, I think, and I will start with you, Tom, and then Anne and Judge and Jack. Feel free to jump in. Most of our questions have to do with follow-up from many of your comments, but this one was one that none of you had addressed. Did the pandemic have anything to do with this wave of unhappiness or distrust or all of this sort of scrutiny of, is our democracy working? Was it an accelerant? Did it have nothing to do with it, or is it a primary driver of it?
Would you like me to start, Ann,
Yes.
on this? Yeah. Well, I think many analysts would agree that the pandemic has been an accelerator in many areas. Whether the decoupling that's going on now in the world economy was already getting underway before the pandemic, and it has greatly sped it up. And so I think it's been an accelerator on many of the trends we're talking about here: lack of trust, the whole debate about masks and how to handle, the citizens' responsibilities in a pandemic situation. There's been so much division on that, and people lacking trust in government decisions on both sides. So, and I think, for some Americans, seeing that many of their fellow Americans don't care enough about possibly infecting their fellow citizens, that can definitely hurt trust. And on the other side, people saying, well, my child shouldn't have to wear a mask, and other people are demanding that they do that, and that is a fundamental issue for me. And so I think trust is eroded by what's happening. One would hope that a pandemic like this would bring people together. I believe that it's the global threats of all kinds, climate, pandemics, et cetera, that ought to be bringing us together as a nation, but also bringing us together with other countries internationally. And I'm afraid that it's having the opposite effect, so far at least.
Anne or Jack, do either of you have a comment on the pandemic before we move on?
So in my view, the divisions were there, and the pandemic accelerated and revealed them. That there would be a part of the Republican Party that would prefer to participate in an anti-vax movement that they themselves know is unscientific and dangerous, simply because they didn't want Joe Biden to be successful, and therefore encourage many people to die, is not something I would have been able to predict. I didn't see that coming. And I think that was the result, and not it was a result of polarization that was accelerated by the pandemic. I don't think the pandemic caused that. But yes, I do, I don't think it was the cause. I think I'll just finish with that. It was the result.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. Just quickly, I mean, it's not a cause. It is really an accelerant here. But, I think one way of looking at it is, in serious crises like this in the past have generally brought people together. Perhaps this wasn't a serious enough crisis for people, but maybe it was a serious crisis that was not appreciated by those who have been using it to fan the flames of unrest, so for political gain. So I think that it could have been a time for people to come together. It wasn't.
We have a lot of questions that come out of the kind of the fundamental structure of our Constitution and our political system, and they revolve around, for example, the two-party system. We've talked about gerrymandering and some of the weaknesses that have evolved with our two-party system when it wasn't anticipated at the time of the Constitution. We have a specific question around that, which is, you all are quite familiar with, especially European countries or other democracies. Do countries that have multiple parties do better? Is their likelihood of maintaining and sustaining their democracy higher than ours, because we've allowed our two-party system to become so polarizing in our culture and everything else? So would we be better if we had the ability to do something to reduce the power of our two parties? And followed on that was a very specific question about ranked choice voting. Would this be a way to kind of reduce the absolute polarization that at least the current structure of our two-party voting system has created. So questions around, can we do some things to change the fundamentals of how we're governing ourselves right now that could improve the quality and the likelihood of our democracy succeeding? So Anne, maybe you want to start with
Yeah,
that.
I'm happy to answer that. I've thought a little bit about that. I mean, I don't want to idealize multi-party political systems, which usually come from, I don't want to bore everybody with different kinds of voting systems, but they usually come from proportional representation rather than first past the post, and they allow for the existence of several parties. And they also have their flaws. They make possible political representation of extremism in a way that our system historically has not. And so there are things that are wrong with them. It is true, though, and this is shown in multiple studies taken over many years, that multi-party systems do encourage consensus because they require it. In order to have a government, parties have to cooperate with one another, therefore they have to come up with joint programs and platforms. And so it encourages a different kind of political language, and everybody knows that the party they're voting for that will have 17% of the vote, it might be in the government, but it won't be the only party, and therefore they have to share. And so that creates a different attitude and language around politics and can make it less polarized. Ranked choice voting has a similar, and although I should say, bringing that to the United States is almost unthinkably difficult. I mean, it would require change to the Constitution. I find it hard to see how, deep changes to our laws, and I find it hard to see how that would happen. It's not impossible. We have made big changes like that before. But it's a harder. Ranked choice voting is an easier one because, as I understand it, it's something that states can decide to do. They can experiment with it. And ranked choice voting means that when you vote in an election, you don't just vote for one person, you vote for people in order. And that means that you can vote for one, there are different versions of it, 1, 2, or 3 people, or you can put people in an order. And that means that candidates have an interest in reaching people outside of their little bubble because it can help them to be the number 2. They want some number 2 votes because it doesn't just matter who gets voted for as number 1, that you also get some points for being number 2. And so so candidates have an interest in reaching a broader group of people. And again, it all depends how you set it up and how it works, but some experiments show that this would work. And this is something that you could do. I mean, Maine has done it. There are a number of other states that have done it or considering do it. Some localities have done it. I think New York City did it somewhat unsuccessfully, but so you need to make sure you know what you're doing. But it is a possibility. It could reduce the rancor around politics, certainly at the state level.
Tom or Jack, do either of you have a view on multiple parties or the ranked choice voting?
Jack, why don't you?
Well, everyone likes the idea of having a lot of different parties. It hasn't worked in the way our system has set up. I think 20 years ago, I would have vigorously defended our system, our two-party system, with occasional third parties being involved as the best. The system of checks and balances, generally speaking, has worked well throughout our history. Today, I'm a little bit more concerned that maybe that's not the right answer. Parliamentary system is not ideal, of course, and I don't know how we could ever change to a system like that here. It's so radically different. But at the same time, I'd like to see ways to better encourage third parties as perhaps an outlet for some of the dissatisfaction that people have with our major political parties today. And I think our experience in Minnesota with ranked choice voting in our primary major cities has been good so far. I don't hear a lot of complaints about it.
I might just add that in addition to sort of the rigidity of our two-party system, where it's pretty clear that there are at least 2 different parties within each of our 2 main parties, vying for influence. But in addition, our party structures have weakened in recent decades. Parties do not have the mediating role that they had before. The old smoke-filled room was not a good thing, but to have outside candidates coming, like Trump, for example, and basically staging a hostile takeover of parties is arguably a problem because parties do have a very important mediating role in our democracy. I would just add that having the actual leader of the state be also the symbolic leader of the state, many Europeans wonder about that. I mean, in England, you've got a different representative of the country, and in parliamentary systems, a prime minister usually is not invested with the symbolic gravitas that an American president is. And so you could argue that, some of these changes, and Jack, I'll direct this to you, it would require a change in our Constitution. I mean, we adhere so strictly to the Constitution, nobody wants to tamper with it, but do you see major constitutional reform coming?
I can't see major constitutional reform coming, Tom. I don't see how it is possible. It's hard to amend our Constitution. And the problem is, for every part of the Constitution that you or I might find unworkable today and a product of thinking 230 years ago, for every part of the Constitution that we don't like, someone else likes. It's all about making sure the system works for you, and sometimes antiquated systems work for your party or for your candidates. And so therein lies the problem of ever trying to amend it in a substantial way.
We've had a couple of questions about a topic that none of you have raised, but is often raised in a discussion of what's happening to our democracy, and that's the media. And you've talked about technology, but not necessarily the media companies themselves. And we have a fairly specific question. And Jack, maybe I'll start with you because perhaps maybe you've had more of this in front of you. Changes in the fairness doctrine in 1989, did that allow what they would call the erosion of the quality of our media? And so I don't know if you have an opinion on that. I mean, they're clearly trying to, I think, say how is the changes in our media and impacted the change in our democracy, and was it driven by a legal change?
Well, I think that the elimination of the fairness doctrine has had an impact. I'm not sure that it was really a great way to regulate media back in the day when it was present. But at the same time, it has resulted in fairly dramatic changes because people are tribal in the media that they watch as well. And I think that that does not force us to listen to other voices. It doesn't force us to build a consensus. It keeps us in our silos or in our tribes. And therefore, I think it's been detrimental to have disregarded the age-old idea that we should be fair in a media that we grant a substantial license to broadcast to the American people.
Tom or Ann, do you have an opinion on whether that horse has left the barn, or whether there is something that we could do or that should be done with regard to media that would help shore up our democracy or reduce the changes in our democracy that we're seeing?
Ann, you want to?
I don't have a strong view about the fairness doctrine. I suspect it's something that can't be brought back. It's a representative of a different era. And I would focus on the regulation of social media to start with. And I think actually social media feeds into broadcast media and print media in such a powerful way. I mean,